Okay, hi there and welcome to another video. This time looking at the economics of rent controls in the housing market, focusing again on building chains of reasoning in your analysis to get great KAA marks, good use of diagrams, and then how to build strong evaluation points along the way. Housing is always a topical economics issue for exams. Housing available for rent from private landlords has in fact now become the second biggest form of housing tenure after owner occupation. There are an estimated 4.5 million households currently renting property privately, which is about 1 in 5 of all households in the UK. And actually within Greater London alone, 2 million households and rising currently rent. The issue of rental affordability has certainly gone up the political agenda in recent times. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has made some form of rent control a kind of key pillar of his campaign for re-election in the next year or so. Here's some data to show some of the issues here. This is data from a survey by ING in 2018 asking, at what age do you expect to buy your first property? And the numbers show that the people who said, actually, you know what, I don't expect to be able to buy, and approximately across these countries about 1 in 3 people said they didn't expect to buy a house at all. High property prices, the cost of renting, not enough income to afford a mortgage, for example. In Germany that figures 45%, in the UK that figures 41%. So there are significant housing affordability issues. And this chart shows the mean or the average weekly rent in the UK. Figures in blue for England, figures in dark blue take out London, and you can see the weekly rent's gone up, averaging in England just under £200 per week. If you take out London, the figure goes down to about 160. But in London, here are the average monthly rental costs in the summer of 2018. In Westminster, the average property, if you want to rent, will cost you well over £2,000 a month. Brent, £1,500 a month. Even Kingston upon Thames you're paying, and Enfield £1,400 a month. Rent levels in London are at very high levels, and that of course raises the question about whether or not there should be some form of rent control, taking away from the free market principle. We'll take a look at this particular question, assess the case for introducing rent controls in the UK. So this could be an essay question, it could be on the back of a data response stimulus question. We'll do 2 things in this session. One, we'll build a chain of reasoning, and secondly, we'll look at some evaluation points. So here we go. Crucially, when you're building a chain of reasoning to get your top KAA marks, it's very important to build a chunky paragraph using connective phrases. The examiners love students who are able to build sequentially an argument. Start with a definition. Rent controls are a form of maximum price. You might impose a price ceiling in the market for rented housing. To be effective, to have an impact on the market, then a rent control needs to be set below the normal free market equilibrium price. That's a key analysis point. The effects of rent control are shown in my analysis diagram. That's in red, a connective phrase. That's a great way of flagging up to the examiner that you're about to insert a diagram into your answer. The normal market rent is 1, but the capped rent of R2 is then imposed. Well, I'll show you the diagram in a second. As a result, is a connective phrase, demand for rented housing expands, because in theory it's now more affordable for people who are unable to afford a mortgage. They can now maybe rent. We can see from the diagram that some landlords may take properties off the rental market if the capped rent is below R1. This will lead to a contraction of supply at the rent ceiling and lead to a disequilibrium in the market with excess demand. In other words, there's a shortage of rented properties. So that would be a very good chain of reasoning built into one paragraph, and you're making a series of theoretical explanations and tying them together. Okay? Diagram obviously we go with it. Make your diagrams nice and big, please. Half a side of A4 for a diagram, at least half a side. There's almost a case for going bigger than that. Make your diagrams really clear and large so the examiners have confidence. So we've got rent on the y-axis, quantity of rented housing. The free market rent is R1. To have any effect on the market, the price must be set below R1. There's no point setting it above. So there's the free market equilibrium. So if we set the rent at R2, the ceiling is below. Well, good news for some people because they can now afford to rent a property at a cheaper rent than before. But equally, we're hinting in our chain of reasoning that some landlords may say, enough of this, I'm going to actually not make as many rooms or houses available for rent at R2. So you end up with a shortage equal to Q3, Q2. And just in terms of evaluation points, you don't necessarily have to impose rent control. You could offer a housing subsidy, a rent subsidy, which is the equivalent of an increase in sort of purchasing power for the tenant. So just imagine, consider that as an example. Instead of a capped rent, subsidise the rent for housing. Crucially, let's go back a stage actually. Let's go back one slide. So that is a solid analysis diagram, and that will get you to a certain level of analysis on the KA score. What the examiners really want you to do in A-level exams is to take your diagram a little stage further, develop the diagram, bring in some other concepts, or just take it a little stage further. And I'm doing that here. So the capped rent is R2. The quantity available is now Q3. Can you see here that actually at Q3, some people would be willing to pay a much higher unofficial price at, well, I call it P2, it's R2, isn't it? They'd be willing to pay R2, unofficial rent, if you like. And in the sense, the landlords could conceivably extract that consumer surplus by charging a charge for keys or a monthly maintenance fee or something other than the rent, which of course is capped. So this takes it just a little stage further and says, well, what about the people who actually really want to rent but are willing to pay more than the capped rent? And that's a nice bit of extended analysis. So sooner or later in the answer, you're going to have to assess the case for rent control. So you have to build arguments for and against. I'll just take you through 3 examples here. First argument is that rent controls are needed because perhaps landlords are making supernormal profits. Perhaps they're exploiting people who can't afford to buy, those people in desperate housing need, and therefore you could justify a rent control on the basis of sort of limiting, constraining those supernormal profits. On the other side, the flip side, a counter argument is that if you hold rents down below the market rent, some landlords will actually withdraw their investment. They might actually take some housing completely off the market permanently. And that would allow you to draw this diagram. What I've done here is I've shown a fall, an inward shift in market supply at the rent, capped rent R2. Of course, that makes the shortage even worse in the market. You can make that your evaluation point. A second argument in favour of rent controls is that rents limit the geographical mobility of labour, pardon the spelling error there, therefore keep structural unemployment higher. Should be an either. So high rents, again, make it harder for people to move from place to place, city to city in search of work. And so if you're linking rental costs with structural unemployment, that's really good synoptic economics. So that's the case for rent control. On the other hand, if you impose a rent control, landlords, well, they might make fewer houses available for sale, or equally they might just cut back in other areas. So they might, for example, cut back on maintenance spending, and that would reduce the overall quality of the housing stock available for rent, and also might increase the risk for tenants. For example, carbon monoxide or damp in a property. So if you cut back on your property maintenance, the cracks might soon start to appear in your rented properties, hopefully not as bad as that picture suggests. A third argument in favour of rent control is that if you cap a rent, effectively that brings down the price and therefore people's real disposable incomes go up. But if you don't cap the rent, people have less money to spend on the basics, such as food and fuel. And actually, unless you cap rents, people will be placing more demands on the welfare system of the state. They'll be claiming more universal credit, for example. High rents may be increasing demand for food bank use as well. On the other hand, the counter argument is that some landlords may actually just demolish homes for rent if they don't think they're getting a sufficient return, and build some new homes, but actually build them for people to buy, not to rent. And if you're cutting back on rented housing, that can drive prices even higher, especially in areas where property is a major problem. So in other words, they'll close down the rented housing available for younger people and replace them with perhaps fewer homes, bigger homes for people with a higher income, and that makes property affordability even worse. There's lots and lots of evaluation points you can make in this kind of question. You just got to choose your ground and make your case. Just want to finish with 3 examples of an evaluation approach. So when you're evaluating any issue, any contemporary issue, here are 3 examples of how you can evaluate. The first is to think about the phrase in theory but in practice. So in theory, rent controls are probably not a good idea. Most economists would argue against them. The evidence, in practice, the evidence from cities where rent control has been chosen as a policy is decidedly mixed. It may have worked in some cities, but in many cities it hasn't. If it's a data response question, for example, pick out some evidence from the extracts and say, well, here's some evidence that actually in theory it might work, but in reality it doesn't. It's a great evaluation phrase to use. A second approach is to say, well, instead of a rent control, might there be a more effective policy in the long term? So, for example, instead of just capping rents, should we be using tax incentives, other supply side policies to increase the rate of new house building, relaxing planning laws, encouraging innovation, flat pack homes, that kind of stuff, so we increase the stock of affordable homes? That might be a better policy in the long term than rent control. And finally, we can challenge the assumptions. So I said, for example, that high rents might be landlords profit maximizing and trying to scalp tenants. Well, that may not be the case. We shouldn't always assume that private landlords necessarily are profit maximizers. I mean, who are the landlords? Most landlords tend to be fairly small. They own 1, 2, possibly 3 properties. Many of them are quite old, relying on income from their property. They're not necessarily big, unscrupulous corporations. Instead of being profit maximizers, for example, they could be satisficers, charging a reasonable rent, given the local economic circumstances, and just doing as well as they can. Don't assume that all landlords are rabid profit maximizers. Many are not. Either way, I hope that this little video has helped take you through this particularly current topic on rent control. If you want some more notes, some data, some detail, just point your smartphone camera at the QR code and that should take you to our landing page on this particular topic. Okay, thank you for joining in this video.